This is Lesson 18.1, Marriage and the Family. What changes occurred in marriage and the family in the course of the 18th century? Lots of demographics here. And we've got College Board Topic 4.1, Contextualizing the Scientific Revolution and the Enlightenment. We're still in the midst of the Enlightenment and its effects on society, particularly its social and demographic effects. And so it says, explain the context in which the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment developed. And we're going to see that. The experiences of everyday life were shaped by demographic, environmental, medical, and technological changes. And by the 18th century, family and private life reflected new demographic patterns and the effects of the commercial revolution. We also have College Board Topic 4.4, 18th century society and demographics. Explain the factors contributing to and the consequences of demographic changes from 1648 to 1815. So we have that, and it says, although the rate of illegitimate births increased in the 18th century, population growth was limited by the European marriage pattern and in some areas by various birth control methods. And then we have College Board Topic 4.7, Causation in the age of the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment. Explain how and why the scientific revolution and the Enlightenment challenged the existing European order and understanding of the world. Places, Western Europe, our time frame is about 1740 to 1795, but we also have a particular discussion of England from 1603 to 1625, the reign of King James I. So, 1750 marked big changes between the first and second halves of the 18th century, right down the middle. See, before 1750, the rate of illegitimate births was very low throughout Europe. Life was mostly rural. Open field communities often saw illegitimate births as a threat to social stability. Powerful community controls existed in rural society to control illegitimate births. Priests, ministers, parents, village elders, landlords, all pressured young people to abstain or get married. Often, an unexpected pregnancy set a marriage date once and for all, right? There's a pregnancy, let's set the date. And public humiliation of villagers was common for all kinds of offenses. For example, the rural punishment ritual known as Charivari. The offender was rounded up by the villagers, forced to ride a donkey backwards through the village, and the enforcers would loudly proclaim the offense throughout the procession, and spectators would yell insults and throw rotten vegetables at them. Charivari was a very effective motivator for village people to control their impulses and stay on the straight and narrow. But it was only effective in the rural village context where everybody knew everybody. After 1750, things began to change drastically. The rate of illegitimate births rose dramatically throughout Europe. Life was becoming more urban. A flood of migration to the cities was occurring, and community ties and community controls were loosening. Young men and women had more economic autonomy, and most couples who experienced unexpected pregnancies were intending to marry, and many such women reported that the man had promised marriage. But a rising number of men were simply not following through. Many were no doubt sincere at the time that they made those promises, but low wages, inequality, unstable financial conditions often made men hesitate to marry and take on a child. The margins of society. Prostitution. Lesson 22.3 will talk more about this topic of prostitution, but for now, we'll say this. Before the late 17th century, authorities were surprisingly tolerant of prostitution. There was often a licensing system under which brothels ran, and we see that in some European countries today, such as the Netherlands. And there was a feeling that if you couldn't eradicate it, at least you could regulate it. Many prostitutes were actually poor women who had regular jobs, and they turned to prostitution to make ends meet. And members of their own class did not shun or reject them for doing this. They knew better than anyone how tough the times could be. There was also a high class of courtesans with rich clients. And these rich clients could set them up with every kind of luxury: homes, servants, clothes, cash, of course. And their careers didn't tend to last very long because their rich clients could discard them and move on whenever they wanted. Turning to prostitution had several obvious downsides. The risk of venereal disease was very high. There was violence and crime. European views toward the trade were becoming less and less tolerant. European officials started closing brothels as the 18th century continued, and punishments were severe if the police caught you. The margins of society. Homosexuality was viewed very differently from prostitution. There was little debate in Europe as to how it should be dealt with, and the death penalty was very common. However, different countries enforced it with different levels of intensity. Our textbook makes the point that people of privilege like nobles and royals could get away with homosexuality. But as an example, our textbook uses James I of England, who we've already studied. And one of the skills that we are learning in this class is the skill of using evidence to support an argument. We learned a lot about James I in lesson 15:5. He was the first of the Stuart kings. He lived from 1566 to 1625. And our textbook falls into the narrative that James I was openly gay, that he kept a virtual harem of male lovers, that his lifestyle was common knowledge, and that nobody, including his wife, could do anything about it. However, consider some of this other evidence. With his wife, Anne, he produced 7 live births, 2 stillbirths, and at least 3 miscarriages. So he wasn't ignoring his wife, and he wasn't neglecting his duty. In fact, there's a good deal of historical debate over the question of whether or not James I was actually gay. And when you examine the evidence, the smoking gun has not yet been found by historians. James I might have been gay. Let's say there's a 50-50 chance. But there's evidence to support both sides of the argument. It was rumored at the time. It was suspected at the time. But the evidence is highly circumstantial. Much of the textual evidence has been interpreted very literally with very little allowance for figurative interpretation. Keep in mind that James I must have grown up very lonely. He never knew his parents. His father died very shortly after he was born. His mother, Mary, Queen of Scots, was sent to prison very shortly after he was born. Even his grandparents were all dead when he was still young, and James was raised in the middle of a long, violent religious civil war in Scotland. He was raised by regents and tutors and keepers. So perhaps it's no surprise that James I wore his heart on his sleeve with people he felt close to. There's a difference between having a few encounters and having an all-out lifestyle. Keep in mind that James I made a lot of enemies as King of England. He ruled the Anglican Church, the Church of England, through a narrower range of accepted practices than Elizabeth I had. And this made both the Puritans on one end of the religious spectrum and the Catholics on the other end very unhappy. People were eager to scandalize him. One of the men in his supposed harem was a commoner named George Villiers, who lived from 1592 to 1628. He was 26 years younger than James I, and he makes a good case study in this question. George Villiers was actually very close to both the king and the queen. And between 1614 and 1623, James I lavished Villiers with all kinds of titles and status and high offices. For example, making him the Earl of Buckingham. And the Privy Council, and they're sort of like the president's cabinet. of advisors, finally called upon James I to explain his relationship with George Villiers. And James I said to the Privy Council these enigmatic words. He said, "I, James, am neither a god nor an angel, but a man like any other. Therefore I act like a man and confess to loving those dear to me more than other men. You may be sure that I love the Earl of Buckingham more than anyone else, and more than you who are here assembled. I wish to speak on my own behalf, and not to have it thought to be a defect, for Jesus Christ did the same, and therefore I cannot be blamed. Christ had John, and I have George." The John that the king is referring to is the Apostle John, with whom Jesus was very close, and to whom Jesus entrusted the care of his own mother. And this passage is often presented as not only a piece of evidence, but the primary piece of evidence for showing that James I was gay and that his court was ridden with scandal. Well, here are the problems with this piece of text. Number one, if James I was declaring that he was gay in this text, then he was, by making this comparison, suggesting that Jesus and the Apostle John likewise had the same relationship. And I would argue that it is simply not historically defensible to claim that a religious man like James I would make such a shocking suggestion to his Privy Council. Now, of course, James I could easily have been lying and been trying to deceive the Privy Council about his relationship. If you're looking for a confession, it's just not in the passage. James I confessed merely to loving George Villiers, and that is not the same thing. James I's son, Charles I, was also very fond of George Villiers. Charles I addressed him in letters as dear friend and uncle. And Villiers was the only high official from his father's government that Charles I retained upon becoming king. In the late 17th century, homosexuality in Europe began to transition from an attraction to an identity. And it began in the largest urban centers in Northern Europe: London, Amsterdam, Paris. And these were places where anti-homosexual laws were enforced with less vigor than in places like, for example, Spain. This identity consisted of the things that we would recognize and even expect to see today: dress, mannerisms, vocabulary, language, social circles, values, cultural tastes, aesthetics, professions. Within this identity emerged this new view that homosexual men were fundamentally different from other men. Their same-sex attraction was due to having a different nature. And people outside their group began to see them that way, and they began to see themselves that way. Or you could say they began to self-identify this way. As historians, you have to be careful about what kind of modern concepts you're imposing upon pre-modern texts. Often we read in classical texts or biblical texts that deal with same-sex relations, and we will impose this modern self-identity with which we're familiar upon those texts. And we will assume that these earlier writers are referring to a distinct group of people who have this self-identity. But the concept of a homosexual identity didn't necessarily exist in the minds of writers in these older and ancient societies when they were expressing their views. Women on the margins of society. Same-sex relations between women was also illegal. It was not viewed to be as threatening to society as between men. But women also had another motive here that men didn't have. Life for women was full of constraints. Education was extremely difficult to attain. And there were many professions that women couldn't enter. And there were many rights that women didn't have. And women were expected to stay home, marry, and have children. But what were the possibilities if you could reinvent yourself as a man? Our textbook brings up one example of this, Ulrika Eleonora Stålhammar, who lived from 1688 or 1683, depending on what texts you look at, to 1733. This is a well-known story in Sweden, and you can actually find many examples of women who managed to pull this off for years throughout modern history. And Ulrika Stålhammar was actually the daughter of a retired Swedish military officer who died deep in debt in 1711. Stålhammar always liked manly activities like riding and hunting, and she watched all of her sisters enter into unhappy marriages in order to try to improve the family fortunes. And Stålhammar was herself also arranged to be married to someone she did not want to marry. And so one day, she took her father's clothes, she stole a horse, and she simply rode out of her life without a plan. After doing some odd jobs disguised as a man, Stålhammar joined the Swedish army in 1750 as an artillerist under the name Wilhelm Edstedt. And this was during the Great Northern War against Russia. But she didn't see combat. She served in a local garrison. But as a soldier, she had the option of paying for her own private quarters rather than living in the barracks, which she chose to do for obvious reasons. And she rose to the rank of corporal. Stålhammar fell in love with and married a woman named Maria Lohnmann in 1716. And Maria really thought she was marrying a man at the time. And at first she thought, well, maybe her new husband had some kind of a physical problem. And then, well, maybe that he was maybe some kind of hermaphrodite. And after a couple of weeks, Ulrika Stålhammar fessed up to Maria that she was really a female. And they actually stayed together for years after that. It was Stålhammar's older sister who kind of ratted them out. Elizabeth Katarina found out what was going on after about 9 years, and she eventually pressured Ulrika into quitting the army and turning herself into the authorities after about 2 years of delay. And so the resulting court case became a sensation throughout Sweden, and everyone was interested in finding out how Ulrika Stålhammar had managed to pull this off and fool people for so many years. The court had a midwife give her a complete physical examination, and this midwife reported that Stålhammar was a perfectly normal adult female. But the midwife also said Stålhammar was very flat-chested. At first, the court could not find any laws on the books that Ulrika Stålhammar and Maria Lohnmann might have broken. But officials felt that the two had to be charged with some kind of offense. So the judges looked through a Bible, came up with violating the order of God for dressing as a male, and with making a mockery of marriage. Both Ulrika and Maria testified that their love for each other had been completely spiritual and had never been physical. And this made a very big impression on the judges. The judges felt that they were both very sincere about all of this. And so the court made their sentences extremely light. Ulrika Stålhammar was sentenced to 30 days in prison with just bread and water for food. And the King of Sweden himself, Frederick I, personally intervened and said that she could have more than just bread and water. Maria Lohnmann was sentenced to 14 days in jail, which Frederick I, the king, again intervened in and got reduced down to 8. After they served their sentences, Ulrika Stålhammar and Maria Lohnmann went to live on separate estates, both owned by a rich aunt of Stålhammar's. And they didn't see each other much after that, but wrote to each other often. The decline of toleration. As the 18th century continued, Toleration for all of these fringe behaviors and fringe societies declined significantly. Enlightenment ideas brought a feeling that you could criticize royalty and privilege for loose morals and bad management. And an emerging middle class felt the need to distinguish themselves from such sexual practices. Middle class morality and middle class virtue were seen as a declaration that the middle class was worthy of sharing political power with the elites. And that's an important statement right there.